This is a Federal News Network podcast.
As the tally of fraud and abuse in pandemic relief spending mounts, the Government Accountability Office has a reminder. Program managers have a list of leading practices for preventing fraud. The question becomes, why didn't they use it? Federal Drive host Tom Temin got more from the GAO's Director of Forensic Audits, Rebecca Shea.
I guess at this point it's fair to say we still don't really know the extent of fraudulent and improper payments under the various pandemic relief programs, do we? What's the latest sense of how bad it is?
Yeah, that's true. We will never know the true extent of the fraud, but we do have some estimates at this point and some other information. For example, GAO recently released a report estimating the amount of fraud in the unemployment insurance program, and we estimated that the fraud that occurred in that program was between $100 and $135 billion. The SBA OIG has also estimated fraud in the two lead programs there, PPP and EIDL programs, and they estimate about $200 billion in fraud. And those are just two of the largest programs. And we've also been tracking some of the DOJ cases since the pandemic began. That also gives you a little bit of a sense of the scope of the problem. And at this point, there are nearly 1,400 guilty pleas or convictions, and about 600 more in the pipeline, and of course, many, many more under investigation at this point.
I can remember when the entire federal budget was $200 billion, and this is how much we threw away on that. But it's fair to say, too, that these were bigger than normal programs, but the rate or percentage of fraud in these cases is beyond band for what we normally expect in programs.
Yeah, that is definitely true. You know, just to give you a sense of the scope, the PPP and EIDL, the SBA programs and unemployment insurance programs, they were about $2 trillion collectively. That's a very attractive target to fraudsters, obviously. But you're right about the fact that the fraud that occurred in the pandemic is worse than what you would expect in normal operations. And that's true for a variety of reasons. There are a number of known risk factors for fraud, and the pandemic programs, they had them all. Some of them were new programs. Some of them were greatly increased funding, you know, with the nearly $2 trillion there. The agencies had to make quick disbursements, and they also had limited controls. Most important among those limited controls was the reliance on self-certification to determine if you get a benefit. So absolutely a much greater fraud in those programs than you would expect in normal operations because of those risk factors.
Because just given the practicalities of the programs, even normally they're pretty big, a certain amount of fraud is to be expected, but it can cost you more to stop it than you would prevent. So in general, there's a risk management or inverted pyramid type of approach to this. Fair to say?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I'm glad you mentioned that because it's important to realize fraud is inevitable. Anytime you have something of value, people are going to try to get it through misrepresentation. But the important thing is to manage the risk of that strategically because it's pennies on the dollar when you try to recover them. So prevention is absolutely the goal here.
And I guess you've told us why fraud was worse in these programs because of these factors present, the newness of them, the great expansion of existing programs, and the limited controls. And that's because I guess they wanted to get everything up and running fast. And unlike the relief for the financial crisis back in 2008 and 2009, at least there was an apparatus set up before some of that money started flowing out.
Yeah, that's right. A couple of other things were going on as well. So agencies were not prepared and not managing their fraud risk strategically prior to the pandemic. The CG, the Comptroller General, testified earlier this year that had agencies been in a better place on that, since the requirements to do that came out in 2016, they would have been better prepared to handle the pandemic. So that's one of the reasons why they weren't very well prepared. And then, as you say, the other issue of trying to get the funds out quickly and making some determinations about the controls that would or would not be in place, as it's been described, lowering the guardrails. And then, again, as you mentioned, there was not that apparatus in place for the government-wide oversight analytic capability that got stood up the initial year of the pandemic. And it is going to sunset again, like the one for the financial crisis did, unless Congress acts to make that permanent.
We're speaking with Rebecca Shea. She's Director of Forensic Audits at the Government Accountability Office. And you testified that GAO for many years has had a reference framework for fraud prevention, some best practices or good practices for this. What are some of those? And I guess why don't agencies use them more? First of all, tell us more about the framework.
Sure. Yeah. It's our fraud risk framework, and it outlines 38 leading practices for strategically managing fraud risk. And it's broken down into 4 different components. And they align with, broad themes that agencies should be covering to strategically manage the fraud risk. The first component relates to creating a culture and a structure to combat fraud. You want to have the right environment. You want to have the right organization to be able to do the things that you need to do throughout the year, regardless of your environment, normal operations or emergency. The second component relates to fraud risk assessments. Many agencies still are operating without comprehensive fraud risk assessment. They aren't even aware of their risks and understanding what controls they have in place to address those risks. So a full review of what your risks are, what you have in place to manage them, the likelihood and impact, and then also what's your tolerance for risk, and will that change, and how does it need to change when you're in normal operations versus steady state? And then what are the consequences of that? The third component relates to the implementing the controls that you need, implementing your fraud profile that you have developed from your fraud risk assessment. And then the last component is to evaluate and adapt that. Fraud does not stay static, right? It continues to change. The risk environment changes. So you want to make sure that the controls that you've figured you need from your fraud risk assessment are actually working as you want them to, and evaluate and adapt that. Then go around in the circle. Our visual for the fraud risk framework is a circle, and it's meant to imply that this is an ongoing process.
Right. So there's really 2 takes that I get from what you've said. One is that if you are already oriented and sensitive to and have programs in place and think about fraud prevention, then when something big comes along, like a new program, you're already at a baseline where you can maybe scale more easily to protect yourself.
That is absolutely right.
And the other is you got to think like a thief and maybe pressure test your own system to see maybe I can try a fraudulent try here. I mean, the food stamp program, SNAP program, has done that for years. They used to go shopping and see if they could use their card to buy beer somewhere and, this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that relates to a resource that is available through Department of Treasury and the CFO Council. They have, years ago, after we issued our framework, they issued an anti-fraud playbook. And it breaks down all of the components and the leading practices from our framework and provides agencies with this nice set of plays for how you can implement that. And one of them is to think like a fraudster. And it helps, the agencies do that, think like the bad guy so that they can figure out how their systems could be broken.
I know when I used to go into banks, back when people went into banks and big lobbies, I used to figure, how would I rob this place? How would I get out? And where would I head if I ever wanted to do that? But I didn't take myself up on that. And
that's good.
In your testimony, you actually described a couple of the fraud mechanisms, which weren't all that clever. They just did it.
Yeah, and you are right about that. They weren't all that clever. And a lot of that relates to the fact that in benefit fraud, there are 2 key issues there. You have the eligibility and identity. On identity, are you who you say you are? And on eligibility, are you entitled to the benefit that you say you're entitled to in the amount? And because self-attestation was accepted as the key control in a number of these programs, the mechanisms used were really pretty simple in a lot of cases. It was false statements and attestations. People just straight up lied. There was document manipulation. They falsified, altered, or forged documents. There was quite a lot of fictitious entities, stolen identities, synthetic identities, shell and shelf companies used to apply for benefits. Some got a little bit more, creative through collusion, use of kickbacks and incentives, and then often, once the funds were received, they were laundered through other mechanisms. But the mechanisms were pretty basic. Now, technology, I will admit, it did help scale up some of those simple mechanisms, because people could apply many at a time, and then also from anywhere in the world. And then also tips were shared, on the dark web and other chat rooms. So simple mechanisms, but then scaled up through some technologies.
Rebecca Shea is Director of Forensic Audits at the Government Accountability Office. We'll post this interview along with a link to the anti-fraud framework at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.